Hello guys, so welcome to our next video. I'm from the Salesforce Traders team, and in this video we're gonna be talking about doing extended exception handling in our Aura components and also about properly using our helper methods and a couple of other things as well. So before we start with today's video, I want to briefly go over what we covered in the last session. That was, we created an Aura component in the form of a basic form, which takes the input as multiple account fields, and then we were creating an account record in our backend database by using an Apex class. And then we implemented a wrapper class in order to do some exception handling, and we were able to have it work like this, where I could put any value in here in the description, and when I clicked on the save button, so it returned me the ID of the account record just created. We were able to open it up in our org, and this was all working fine. So now in the last session, what we did for exception handling was we created a wrapper class which had two parameters, one for the success and for the message. And then we just used it to appropriately send an error message back from our Apex class to our Lightning component. So in today's session, when I talk about doing more exception handling, so this way is one of the ways to implement everything. So let us do one thing, and let us revert this code back to without using this Aura response and the way it was before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all this, and it's not going to use this. It's going to just do the account ID, and I'm going to click on the save. Now we can keep this in. This is not being used, but I'm going to keep it in for now. And then I'll go back to my JavaScript in my helper, and I'm going to remove this error handling that we did. And instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to just let out the ID that we returned. So the returned ID is stored in the result variable now, since the ID is the only thing being returned. So we can just use it directly. Okay, so I go back to my page. I do any value, click on the save. So you see we still get the success, right? But now if I remove the name and I click on save, so we do get the error message, but it is in the form of a JSON. And this is not a user-friendly message. A user might not be able to figure out what is going wrong here with this message, because they'll say all these weird things. And the problem this message is being printed like this is because the error is returned as an object in here. So we can't predict what format this error is being returned. So you're just stringifying it and printed it. So let's say most of you guys must have a question here that maybe we don't just alert it like this. We just alert out errors, whatever we get, right? So that does not work properly. Let's say again, I take an error condition. So you'll not see the actual object in here, but in order to show how the error is returned, let me use something called a console.log. So a console.log is used for debugging purposes in our Lightning, where we can put anything inside the log statement, and then that log statement shows up in your dev console. So how do you open the browser dev console? That is by pressing the F12 key. So if you click on it, this is our browser dev console right here. So you can clear out the console by this button, but let me just refresh the page first. And I clear this out. Let's say I again don't put anything on the name. I click on the save. So you see, I still get the object in here, but this is the actual object that you are doing a console.log on in my console, right? So you'll see this is written in a really weird way, like in the proxy, and then you have multiple fields in here called duplicate results, field errors, and something like that. So the problem is this is like a really complex object, and we'll need to do like things like parsing the JSON, properly getting the element, and then printing the message out. But even then, what happens in Lightning is this error object is different based on what type of exception you get. So it's not a really good practice to use this object directly because it'll cause you issues. So how do we solve it? I mean, one way to do it was, again, the way we did it by using this auto response wrapper. But there is one more way to do it. In that case, you don't need to change this ID parameter. I mean, you'll still return just an ID, but the way to do that is you put a try catch in here. That's the first thing. Like this. Now, what we can do is instead of trying to get the error message or something in here, we can explicitly throw what we called an aura exception. So this aura exception is a standard standard exception class, and this allows us to properly throw exceptions in our aura components, because the way this works is you have to throw it in, just initialize it and throw it like a new aura exception, and any message that you want to send over to your aura component, you can specify it inside the parentheses, just to like, it works as a constructor, right? So you can pass any custom error message inside this aura exception. So in this particular scenario, we are taking the error message from the exception object. So I do this and I click on save. Now, what will happen is if my code breaks, we're still throwing an exception, but instead of the exception being thrown explicitly, we are now, in the case of the exception being thrown implicitly, now the exception is being thrown by our code on this line, and we are able to properly send the error message back. So let me show you guys how it looks like. So I have it here, right? In my JavaScript, I don't need to change anything. Let me remove the errors from here, but instead I'll just put the console.log in here. So I'll show you guys what this looks like. Okay, so let's don't put anything in here, and I'm gonna just do the ESC and I'm gonna click on the save. Oh, I think I need to refresh the page first. Okay, now I don't put anything in the name again. I do this and I click on the save. So you'll see again this returns a proxy object. But if I click on the arrow here, show you guys the actual object. So now it's a lot more simpler than what you were getting earlier with all the fields and everything. So now, even though it still returns like a whole object, the format of this object will not change depending on whatever type of exception you get, because any type of exception you get, you're always going to just throw a new aura exception. Just do it like that. So it'll not matter. So how do you actually handle it in your JavaScript? So let's say I come back here. So now if you throw all the exceptions by using this or exception, that makes sure that this errors object that you get here, this is always returned in this format, And as you can see, this is an array format. So you can easily just access it like this. I mean, you obviously have at least one error. That's why you got into this if statement. So you can just do error 0 to get the error from the first object. And then you can say in here that the message is in this message object. So in this message variable, I'm sorry. So you just alert out the error like this. And let's say we just add an error next to it. And I click on save. All right, I go back to my hug. We don't need the dev console anymore, so I'm going to close it out. So let's say again, I just keep the name as empty and I click on the save. So now you see the error is again a lot more readable than before. And this looks kind of the same back when we used this aura response instead. So instead of using a wrapper class, you can also just use the standard aura exception class and throw an exception with it so that you always get back your errors in your JavaScript like this. All right, so this is another one more way to do enhanced exception handling in your Aura components. As to what approach is better, that is completely up to you guys. Depends on your use case, depends on your problem. If you wanna go ahead and create an Aura response, generally we use this when you want like multiple things to be returned. What I mean by that is, so we were just returning the ID from this method. So we didn't need to do much of anything. But if you want your response to contain a lot of things, then generally the better way to do it with a wrapper class. But if your method is not going to return a lot of stuff, you can just go ahead by using an Aura exception and doing it that way. All right, so that was it for your custom exception handling. Another way to do it, and using this Aura exception to properly handle all your exceptions in your JavaScript as well. Okay, all right. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is your helper methods. So we previously touched it in our last session that we use helpers to reuse code. And what we did was we defined all our backend handling or Apex class method calling in our helper method. And we call this helper method from our JavaScript controller, this one, and we called it by doing a helper.helper save. So now one way to reuse this is, let's say further down the road, I have one more method here in my JavaScript controller. So obviously what I can do is I can call this save method again, the helper save method again in this save too. So this reuses a lot of the code in my helper, right? You can call this as many times you want, or what you can do is you can even call this twice based on some scenario you have or anything, right? So this is like one way to reuse it. Also, there is one more thing that you could do. So let's say I define a second method in my helper as well. So obviously, again, you can define multiple methods in your helper as well. So right now, what I'm doing this alert by just printing out the alert right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a method called show message. And this is going to be a function. It is going to return, or I mean, receive a parameter called MSG, which is a message. And inside this, I'm going to write the alert statement here, like this. Now, what I can do is I can call this method inside my first helper method by doing something like this. So whenever I want to alert anything, instead of writing this alert here, I'll write this dot show message, and I'm going to pass in everything from here inside this. We're gonna remove the hard-coded alert statement and don't need the console log anymore. The same way, we're gonna call our second helper method from our first helper method like this. So now you'll notice one thing. So the first thing is we are using like a this dot keyword here, and this show message is this second method that I just created. So when you want to call a method in your helper from another helper method, you can just use this keyword to call it like this. All right, you can use this or show message. So this will look for a method called show message inside the helper and just call it. So let's go back to our component, and again we test it out, we save it. So yeah, the alert still shows up, so which means our helper method is working properly. Now you can also call this method directly here as well, since it is in the helper. So just like you were calling the helper save, you can also do helper.show message. And let's say I'm going to put in here Salesforce drillers is the best. And I click on the save. We don't need this second method or let's just keep that in. So we do this. So now I refresh this. And again, I'm going to restore the error scenario. Keep the name empty. So you see, we got this Salesforce error is the best message. And then we also got the error message being displayed, right? So it called your same method and also called the show message here directly, which resulted in us showing the alert message, which we passed into it called Salesforce best, right? So key points to take from this are you can call any helper method from your JavaScript controller by doing helper dot the method name. And inside your helper methods, you can call any other helper method from any of your methods in the helper by using a this dot keyword. But now, can you call this save to method from this save method, just like you are able to do in the helper where you were able to call show message from the first method? So in the JavaScript controller, the answer is no, that you cannot do that, because let's say I try and do I'm going to call this save to from my first method by trying to do this dot save to, and I'm going to pass all the parameters here from here. So this should ideally pass everything into this and call the second one as well. And let's say instead of doing this, we put an alert in our second method called second method called. So now if I click on the save button from the markup, ic.save will go to the helper saving method, and then we're going to try and calling the save to method from here by this keyword. And if this second method is called, we'll see this message here. All right, so let's go back, refresh the page. Let's put test VSC and then click on save. So you see, even though we got the success, we still got an error here. So the success pop-up came from this helper method. Obviously, that worked fine. But when we tried to call this save to, we get an error that cannot read property save to of undefined, which means that this keyword does not work in your JavaScript controller the way it does in your helper. So you cannot call a second JavaScript controller method from your first JavaScript controller method. All right. So this is how your helper works. So you guys need to keep this in mind while developing your Aura components in the future. Okay, so we can remove this. If you want to call any other method like this, there's no easy way to do it. You can either move all the code inside this from here to a helper and then call the helper. But in simple terms, you cannot call save to method from the same method in your JavaScript controller. Okay, now let's move on to our final topic of this session, which is to showing our toast messages and then a couple of things about how your components inherit CSS and the standard Lightning design library. Okay, so till now, when you're trying to show this message, you're just using the standard HTML alert, right? So, but there is a better way to do this, which is by using the Salesforce toast message directly. We're going to talk about how we can do that in here. So the way you show toast messages in Salesforce is, we'll talk about this in a later session as well. The syntax goes something like this. We do a var action equals to, we'll need to pass the component most probably here. I'm gonna walk you guys through everything that we do, so just hold on. And we do something like this. So instead of using the CMP dot, what you're gonna do is you're gonna do $A dot get, oops, I think that's on the correct send. Yeah, $A dot get, and inside you're gonna write E dot force colon show toast. So this is gonna be covered in the next session. So this is actually Aura event, a standard Aura Lightning event, and what this event does is it shows a toast message to the user. How that looks like, we're just gonna check in a second. So the way you pass your message in this is like this. You need to do action dot set params, kind of similar to how you pass parameters here, right? So we're gonna use the same logic in here. The only difference being now the parameter name here is message, and you can pass whatever value you want to it. You're gonna pass this message parameter that we are receiving. Also, let's introduce one more parameter here called type. So this type is, let's say type of message. So this type of message goes to this type right here. So this actually makes sure what type of pop-up this is, if this is an error message or if this is a success message. Right, and then we're gonna also pass one more thing here called title of message, and that helps the pop-up message to show a title into it. Here we'll look at it here. So after you set the parameters, all you have to do is to action.fire. This should show you a pop-up message. But here is something interesting. We show that everything here is correct, but let me go back to our component here, refresh it again, and I'm gonna again put it as empty and click on the save. So you see we get this error that cannot read properties in terms of undefined. What that means is this action is undefined for some reason here. When we are doing this, it is not finding this event. So the reason this happens is you cannot use this event in here unless you place this component on an actual Lightning page instead of a Lightning application. And the reason for that is these events, like this show toast event or this functionality, is not accessible to you in a Lightning application. So these are not accessible in your Lightning applications, but when you actually put it inside a Lightning page, then these events are accessible. So now the question arises, how do you put it in a Lightning page? So we got over this in our first session in the introduction. So the first thing you need to do is when you want to put this Lightning component in a Lightning page, then you need to implement this interface in here, which is FlexiPage available for all page types. And I'll show you why this matters. So first, let's go back to our org and let's switch to the Lightning experience. Now, just like in our introduction session, what you can do is, let's say we go to any home page. Let's go to our service home page. So this is a Lightning page, right? And we have this component here from our first session that we added this component to this first page, right? So let's go ahead here and click on edit page. So you see this basic form component of ours, this one, this shows up here to be used. But this would not have shown up here if we haven't added this interface in here for available for all page types. So you need to add this to your component and then you can use it on our Lightning pages. So let me drag this and drop it in my UI. All right, you see the component is added and I click on save. And then I go back. Now, this is our component in here, just the way it is showing up here with the account name, description, and year started. So now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an account from here. Let's say Lightning test description, and the year started is 2021. I click on the save. So I think it didn't work because we forgot to do one thing. Let's go back to our helper and let's pass in all these parameters because as of now, it's just passing the message. So first thing we need to pass is the component, and the second is the message, which is already being passed. Then the third thing we want to pass is the type of message. So this is for the error. We're going to pass the type as error. And this is one of the supported types in this toast message. And then in the title, we're going to just say error. So we don't need to write error in the message. Right. Then in our success case, we again need to pass these four parameters to our helper. So again, the first one is going to be your component. Then I'm going to pass in the result here. Then we're going to pass the result, whatever ID we got. Then in the type of the toast, we're going to pass success. And then in the title, we say account created. Again, you should be able to see that we're passing all these to the show toast message here as well. So this should all work just fine. If I click on the save, so in the case of success, the type of the toast is success, this type. Since we are passing this success value in this type of message, and in the case of error, the toast type is error. All right, so let's go back here, refresh this, and now let's test it out by putting any values in here. 2021. So as soon as I clicked on save, this is how the pop-up shows up. And now if I don't put it any values, now an error message should pop up, which it did in this format, and you can see the message in here. All right, so this is how you show a pop-up message by using the show toast as well. The only thing to again keep in mind is the show toast will only work in your Lightning view and when you place your component on a Lightning page. So just make sure of that, guys, and you guys should be able to do it pretty easy. So that's it for this video, guys. Let's meet in our next video where we're going to talk about Lightning events. All right. See you guys. Bye.